it does seem at the moment, at least, that the worst of the selling, that the rapid selling, the liquidations are behind us. But there's still not a lot of bullish catalysts at the moment in terms of the macro landscape, and so I wouldn't rule out obviously further down movements in the price. But I do think that based on most ways of kind of valuing Bitcoin or looking at Bitcoin's history, we are in kind of a deep value zone here. And for example, we're below currently the average on-chain cost basis. And so, it's something like the fifth time in history that Bitcoin's been in that position. And so I at least view this as an opportunity for dollar cost averaging, and maybe layering in if someone was on the fence or concerned about maybe euphoria or high valuations before.
Lyn Alden, founder of Lyn Alden Investment Strategy and Macro Guru, recently gave her outlook on Bitcoin, the world's largest cryptocurrency by market cap. Alden, who has a blended background in finance and engineering, is one of the top macroeconomists with a great grasp of Bitcoin and the rest of the crypto market. In a recent interview, she speaks extensively about the current state of the U.S. economy and its effects on the crypto market. Alden also speaks about Bitcoin as a hedge against inflation and the effects of the SEC rejection of Grayscale's spot Bitcoin ETF application. Last month, after months of back and forths, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission denied Grayscale Investments' application to convert its $13.5 billion Grayscale Bitcoin trust into a spot-based Bitcoin ETF. In her interview, Alden explains that the move is counterintuitive as it would open investors to even more harmful and unregulated products. We will now take you to Lyn Alden's recent Bitcoin interview. But before we do, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to drop your comments and observations below. Let's dive right in. Alden begins her interview by speaking about the current market volatility and the factors driving it. In previous interviews, the macro guru had noted that Bitcoin does not perform well in economic decelerating markets. However, Alden is convinced that Bitcoin still retains its status as a hedge against inflation. Please listen as Alden discusses her current outlook on Bitcoin and the U.S. economy as a whole.
This is probably lower than I would have expected as a base case. In my research, I was outlining the fact that Bitcoin historically has not done very well in economic decelerating environments. So let's say Purchasing Managers Index and other economic indicators like that, when they start decelerating, generally that's been Bitcoin sideways action or outright bear markets. And I wasn't sure if this one would be different because of the high inflation, but so far obviously it's proven not to be. And so there were a lot of reasons to be defensive for this year. As for the second part about it being an inflation hedge, one thing that I think is very clear is that there's different types of inflation. There's monetary inflation, and then there's price inflation that often comes with a lag after that monetary inflation. And what we've actually seen for the most part is that Bitcoin is correlated very strongly with money supply growth, global M2, especially as measured in dollars. And so over the past couple of years, as we got that huge ramp up in broad money supply around the world, Bitcoin did very well. And then ironically, when, actually, as one would expect, when you started to get a reduction in the amount of money supply growth, and you started to see the Fed and some other central banks actually try to push back on the price inflation that was materializing, that's when Bitcoin has, and many other assets for that matter, have begun to struggle. So I would say that Bitcoin's been a useful hedge against monetary inflation, but that precedes the actual price inflation. So it's obviously not been a very well-timed hedge against the price inflation that manifests after that monetary inflation. I'm looking for mostly recession indicators, and so it's kind of an unusual environment where we see a lot of economic deceleration across the board. So PMIs, purchasing manager indices are rolling over. Lots of leading indicators are rolling over. We just got like another yield curve inversion. There's a couple different yield curves you can watch, and they've been flashing all these kind of at least yellow signals for a recession. Most of the composite GDP estimating tools out there are pointing towards kind of a technical recession. The one area that's held up pretty well is employment. And that, historically, that's somewhat of a lagging indicator anyway, but it is holding up somewhat better than you'd expect given the other indicators that are happening. And so generally, an inflationary recession is an unusual environment for developed markets over the past 40 years or so. And so there are certainly a lot of indicators that are throwing analysts off. And so what I'm basically trying to monitor over time is what's happening with economic acceleration, what's happening with energy markets in particular, what are some of these big crises that can happen. For example, Europe is in a very vulnerable position in terms of energy security. And so there's a bunch of different things like that that I'm watching in this environment. But a lot of it right now boils down to what's happening with the US economy and how's the Fed going to have to respond to that going forward.
The macro guru also discusses the Grayscale spot ETF application rejection and how it could impact the general cryptocurrency market. The SEC decision about the spot ETF shows just how far the cryptocurrency industry still has to go to gain the trust of policymakers in the United States. The SEC has rejected over a dozen spot Bitcoin ETF applications in the past year. According to reports, the regulatory agency has been concerned about applicants' lack of surveillance sharing agreements with regulated markets relating to spot funds' underlying assets. After rejecting Grayscale's application, the Commission has now extended the deadline for approving or disapproving Cathie Wood's ARK21 shares spot Bitcoin ETF. The previous deadline was July 16, but it has been extended by 4 to 5 days to August 30. Hopefully, with more acceptance from regulators, U.S. investors will someday have a spot-based Bitcoin ETF. Let's get back to Lyn Alden's interview.
I'm not a regulatory expert. My understanding of Genser's position is that he's using that as a tool because a lot of exchanges are doing things that the SEC is not thrilled about. So a lot of them have tokens on them that are probably considered securities. And in this context, they would be unregistered securities. I also think that there are some concerns about price manipulation on those exchanges. So Genser's made it clear that he thinks Bitcoin itself would fall under the description of being a commodity. But obviously, any things like an ETF or any securities that are based on Bitcoin are under the purview of the SEC. And so I think in his view, he's using that as a tool in order to help the exchanges clean up, or kind of using that as leverage to get the exchanges to clean up. But I think it's somewhat backfiring in many ways, because it means that consumers in the meantime have inferior products if they want to own Bitcoin through their brokerage, right? So obviously, if there are better ways to just buy Bitcoin directly and self-custody it. That's the best way to own Bitcoin. But the reality of the situation is that many people do want to own Bitcoin in their brokerage accounts, and so the fact that there's no spot ETF gives them just a host of inferior products to do that. And so I think that one hand, it would be good to clean up the exchanges and to get them more kind of clarity about their regulations and how they can operate, and how, what are their processes for listing the different tokens that they do. But on the other hand, I think that, consumers would be better off if they had a spot ETF to work with.
You posted that really interesting chart showing how many times Bitcoin has been dead. So I'll close out this interview, Lyn, with, is Bitcoin dead?
So I don't think so. I think it's sleeping. Like I said before, it generally does pretty poor in all these economic decelerating environments. This one has unfortunately been no different. But I think if you look at a lot of fundamental indicators, the underlying situation's healthy. And so, for example, if you look at the number of small on-chain Bitcoin holders, that's actually gone up pretty significantly during the sell-off. And also, I'm really bullish on what we're seeing on the Lightning Network. I think development is continuing there very strongly, and we're actually still seeing a lot of volumes and a lot of growth on the Lightning Network. And so I think when you look past the fact that Bitcoin collateral is used in a lot of this altcoin trading, I think it got caught up in rehypothecation. I think we've obviously had a big liquidation across the industry, and that's not great for price. But I think the underlying network strength is actually showing a lot of good signs at the moment.
What do you think about Lyn Alden's interview? Please drop your comments and observations below, hit the like button, and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching our videos.